When Eric, the son of a hard-working black farmer, corrected his teacher, he was expelled from the school, but the school never expected who would show up the next morning. Stay tuned to witness his grandfather's powerful response that left everyone stunned, and tell us in comments where you're watching from. The bell rang, cutting through the morning chatter at Jefferson Middle School in Birmingham, Alabama. Students shuffled through the hallways, some barely awake, others still talking about last night's football game. But Eric Williams wasn't thinking about sports or social drama. He already knew what was coming. Sliding into his 7th grade science class, he dropped his backpack next to his chair and scanned the worksheet that had been placed on his desk. The title at the top read, "The Evolution of American Agriculture." His jaw clenched. The moment his eyes skimmed over the first few paragraphs, he could already tell this was wrong. At the front of the classroom, Mr. Richard Whitman, a broad-shouldered man, adjusted his glasses and began his lecture. Over the last few decades, traditional farming has become obsolete. Corporate agriculture now dominates the industry, making small, family-run farms nearly non-existent. Eric's grip tightened on his pencil. Obsolete? Nearly non-existent? That was a lie. His family's farm, one of the few black-owned farms in the entire county, was proof of that. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Using precision agriculture, GPS-guided tractors, and soil sensors, they had built a successful farm despite the odds. Yet, here was his teacher, erasing his family's legacy with the stroke of a textbook. Eric wasn't one to challenge authority just for the sake of it, but this wasn't a debate, this was the truth. His hand shot up. "That's not actually true, Mr. Whitman," he said, voice steady. The class went quiet. A few students turned in their seats. Whitman barely glanced at him. "Eric, let's try not to interrupt the lesson." "I'm not interrupting, sir. I'm just saying that small farms haven't disappeared. My family owns one, and we use modern technology, drones, GPS tracking, soil management techniques. Small farms aren't obsolete, they're evolving." A couple of kids muttered under their breath. Someone snickered. But Eric wasn't joking. Whitman let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Eric, I think I'll trust the experts who wrote the textbook." Eric straightened in his seat. "But the textbook is wrong." Silence. Whitman's expression shifted. What started as amusement quickly turned into irritation. He set down his book and folded his arms. "This class follows the curriculum. If you have concerns, you can discuss them after class." Eric's fingers curled into fists under his desk. "So, we're supposed to just copy the wrong answers?" Now, the room felt tense. A few students exchanged glances. Others held their breath. Whitman's face darkened. "You're being disruptive." "I'm just telling the truth." That was it. Whitman's voice snapped like a whip. "Office, now." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Eric's stomach twisted. His pulse pounded in his ears. For telling the truth? He grabbed his backpack and stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on him. As he walked toward the door, he heard a boy mutter, "Dude, you should have just kept your mouth shut." But that wasn't who he was. As Eric stepped into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him, he had no idea this was only the beginning. Eric walked down the hallway, his footsteps sharp against the polished tile. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't loud or disrespectful. He had simply told the truth, and now he was being sent away like he'd done something wrong. By the time he reached the principal's office, the secretary, Mrs. Dunbar, barely glanced up. "Mr. Whitman already called," she said, nodding toward a chair. "Sit down." Eric dropped his backpack to the floor and sat. His knee bounced. Minutes dragged. Finally, the door creaked open. Principal Henry Caldwell stepped out. His tired eyes swept over Eric like he'd already made up his mind. "Come in." Eric pushed himself up and walked inside. The office smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and old books. Behind Caldwell's desk, Mr. Whitman was already seated, arms crossed. This wasn't a conversation. This was a verdict waiting to be handed down. Caldwell leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "Eric, Mr. Whitman says you were being disruptive in class." Eric kept his voice steady. "I corrected something in the lesson. The textbook was wrong." Whitman scoffed. "Eric continued arguing after I told him to stop," he said flatly. "That's not how a classroom works." Caldwell exhaled. "Eric, even if you disagreed, there's a time and place for discussion. Maybe you should have spoken to Mr. Whitman after class." Eric's jaw tightened. He laughed at me. Caldwell hesitated, then sighed. I have no reason to believe Mr. Whitman was being disrespectful, but he felt you were disrupting the lesson. He leaned back, already finished with the matter. You're suspended for the rest of the day. Eric's stomach dropped. Further action will be discussed tomorrow. It took everything in him to keep his face blank. Suspended. For knowing more than his teacher. Mrs. Dunbar had already called his mother. 20 minutes later, Sharon Williams arrived. She wasn't angry, she was worse. Silent. She signed the suspension papers, barely looking at the principal, then gestured for Eric to follow. The ride home was tense. Eric stared out the window, watching the streets blur past. Finally, she spoke. You want to explain why I had to leave work for this? His fingers tightened around the strap of his backpack. I told the truth. She let out a slow breath. You could have told the truth after class. Eric shook his head. He wasn't going to listen. She didn't argue. But when they pulled into the driveway, his father was already outside. David Williams stood by the porch, arms crossed, his face unreadable. A man of few words, he carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had spent years fighting battles others never saw. But the real battle wasn't his to fight anymore. It belonged to the man standing behind him. James Williams, Eric's grandfather. James stepped forward, his 6'4" frame casting a long shadow across the porch. His silver beard was neatly trimmed, his dark jeans and pressed button-up crisp as ever. There was a weight to his presence, the kind that didn't need raised voices to be felt. James Williams wasn't just a farmer. He was a fighter, a retired military veteran who had come back home to rebuild his family's land, a land that people had spent generations trying to take from them. Developers had tried to buy him out. Banks had denied him funding. They told him to give up. He never did. And now, the same system that had tried to erase him was trying to erase his grandson. James cracked his knuckles, gaze steady. They want to send my grandson home like he's some delinquent. Then his lips curled into a smirk. Fine. He glanced toward the field. But tomorrow, we send a message. The sun had barely risen when James Williams set his coffee cup down with a quiet clink. Across the kitchen, Eric sat at the table, picking at his untouched toast. His mother paced near the window, phone in hand, murmuring something under her breath. His father, David, leaned against the counter, arms folded, staring out at the open fields. The air in the room was thick, not with fear, but with the weight of what was coming. James finished the last sip of his coffee, wiped his hands on a cloth, then turned to his grandson. Put on a clean shirt, he said, adjusting his cufflinks. You're coming with me. Eric blinked. Where? James finally looked at him, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. To school. Before Eric could ask why, he heard it. A deep, distant rumble. The kind that made the windows tremble. His father set down his coffee, his expression unreadable. His mother froze. Eric pushed back from the table and ran to the front door, throwing it open just in time to see it. A black helicopter cutting through the sky. His breath caught as the aircraft descended, kicking up dust as it hovered over the family's field. The blades whipped through the air, sending leaves flying, making the horses in the distance stir. James stepped onto the porch, buttoning his sleeve. We're taking that? Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His grandfather adjusted his collar, eyes steady. I told you, boy. We're sending a message. His mother shook her head, rubbing her temples. Daddy, is this really necessary? James turned to her, voice calm. You want your son to learn to keep his mouth shut when he knows he's right? She hesitated, then slowly shook her head. James nodded. Didn't think so. The pilot was already waiting as James climbed inside, settling in like he'd done this 1,000 times before. Eric didn't hesitate. He followed his grandfather, strapping in as the helicopter doors shut. The moment his buckle clicked into place, the engine roared, and the ground disappeared beneath them. His stomach flipped, but he barely noticed. Because today, they weren't just going back to school. They were making an entrance. The morning at Jefferson Middle School started like any other. Principal Henry Caldwell sat in his office, stirring a cup of coffee, already exhausted. The school board was breathing down his neck about test scores. Parents had been sending in complaints about everything from cafeteria food to dress code violations. And now, he had this situation with Eric Williams. Whitman had assured him it was handled. Caldwell sighed, rubbing his temples. He hated conflict. He wasn't interested in fairness or who was right. He just wanted things to run smoothly. Then Mrs. Dunbar burst through the door. Her face was pale, her voice unsteady. "Sir," she stammered. Caldwell barely looked up. "What is it, Mrs. Dunbar?" She swallowed hard. There's a helicopter landing on the football field." Caldwell blinked. "Excuse me?" Before she could repeat herself, a low, rhythmic vibration shook the room. The walls trembled. Books rattled on the shelves. His coffee rippled. Then, chaos. Students rushed to the windows. Teachers abandoned their lessons, peering through the blinds. Phones were out, cameras rolling. In the middle of the football field, a sleek black helicopter descended, kicking up dust and grass. And stepping out, moving like he owned the place, was James Williams. Inside the school, the tension was suffocating. Students whispered. Some laughed in disbelief. Others stared in shock. A kid from the 7th grade hallway muttered, "Yo, is that your grandpa?" Eric barely nodded. Security guards hurried toward the field, but James didn't even slow his stride. The principal stormed outside, his face flushed, tie slightly loosened. He looked like a man already regretting his morning. "Mr. Williams," Caldwell called, voice nearly drowned out by the sound of the chopper blades. "What is the meaning of this?" James adjusted his sleeves, speaking with calm certainty. "The meaning," he echoed. "The meaning is that my grandson was kicked out of school for knowing more than the man teaching him, and that doesn't sit right with me." Caldwell ran a hand down his face. "I understand you're upset." James chuckled. "Son, I don't get upset." He stepped forward, boots crunching against the grass. "I get answers." And at that moment, everyone knew. This wasn't just a visit. It was a warning. James Williams didn't wait for permission. He walked straight past Principal Caldwell, heading for the main entrance of the school like he owned the building. Eric followed, gripping his backpack, still trying to process what was happening. Behind them, Caldwell scrambled to keep up. "Mr. Williams, you can't just walk in here unannounced." James stopped at the front doors and turned, his gaze sharp. "Your school had no problem throwing my grandson out without a fair discussion," he said, voice calm. "So consider this my way of announcing that I'd like one." Caldwell swallowed. James wasn't yelling, but somehow his words carried more weight than if he had. The security guards hesitated. The principal hesitated, and James walked through the doors. At that moment, every student, every teacher, every staff member knew. The man wasn't asking. He was taking control. The main office felt smaller than usual. James sat across from Principal Caldwell's desk, his fingers tapping against the armrests. Eric sat next to him, quiet but watching everything. Across from them, Mr. Whitman stood by the filing cabinets, arms crossed, his expression tight. Caldwell leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Mr. Williams," he started, "I understand you have concerns, but I assure you this isn't personal. Eric was simply being disruptive in class." James tilted his head slightly. "Disruptive," he repeated. He turned to Whitman. "Tell me exactly what my grandson did." Whitman straightened. "He repeatedly challenged my lesson. I gave him a direct instruction to stop, and he ignored it." James nodded slowly. "So let me get this straight," he said. "A child corrects false information in your lesson, and instead of encouraging discussion, you punish him?" Whitman's jaw tightened. It wasn't the time or place. James leaned forward slightly. "Then when is?" The room went silent. Eric swallowed. He had never seen a teacher struggle for words before. Whitman finally cleared his throat. Regardless, Eric's behavior was inappropriate. James let out a low chuckle. He tapped the desk. "Boy, I was in the military. I know what inappropriate looks like." His eyes locked onto Whitman. "A kid correcting a teacher? That ain't it." Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Williams, we can discuss this rationally." James raised a brow. "Oh, I am rational. That's why I came here first. Instead of taking this to the school board, the local news, or..." He glanced at Eric. "Social media." Caldwell stiffened. Because he knew, the moment this went public, it wouldn't just be about Eric anymore. And James Williams wasn't bluffing. A heavy silence filled the principal's office. Caldwell tapped his pen against his desk, shifting in his chair. Whitman looked like he had swallowed something bitter. James Williams sat back, arms crossed, completely at ease. "Let's be real, gentlemen," he said, his voice steady. This ain't about classroom disruptions. It's about control. His gaze flicked to Whitman. You didn't like that my grandson challenged you, so instead of handling it like an educator, you handled it like a man protecting his pride. Whitman's nostrils flared. That's not. James lifted a hand. Careful now. The weight in his voice shut Whitman up instantly. Then he turned to Caldwell. And you, James said, you let it slide because it was easier. You didn't stop to ask whether it was right. Caldwell straightened. Mr. Williams, I understand your concerns. James' eyes narrowed. No, you don't. His voice stayed calm, but sharper now. If you did, you'd be apologizing right now. Instead, you're trying to save face. Caldwell opened his mouth, then shut it. Eric sat frozen. His grandfather wasn't just talking. He was dismantling them, piece by piece. Whitman cleared his throat. With all due respect, I have a curriculum to follow. If every student stopped the lesson to challenge the material. James raised a brow. Did every student challenge the material? Whitman hesitated. No, but did more than one? Whitman clenched his jaw. No. James spread his hands. Then sounds like this isn't a classroom problem. It's a you problem. Whitman's face burned. I didn't mean any harm. James leaned forward, locking eyes with him. Maybe not, but harm was done regardless. Silence. Caldwell cleared his throat, forcing himself to look composed. Mr. Williams, I want to resolve this. What exactly are you asking for? James exhaled through his nose. First, Eric goes back to class. Today. No mark on his record. Caldwell nodded slowly. We can arrange that. James lifted a second finger. Second, he gets a formal apology from you and Mr. Whitman. Eric's breath hitched. An apology? From a teacher? Whitman's face twisted. That's unnecessary. James shrugged. Then I'll have to get in touch with the school board. I have friends there, you know. Might even make a few calls to some local reporters. His expression didn't change, but his voice dropped just enough to make the message clear. You ever seen what happens when a school tries to silence a black student who was just telling the truth? Caldwell stiffened. Whitman swallowed hard. Eric swore he could hear the gears turning in their heads. James was giving them a choice, but not really. Either they did the right thing now, quietly, or they did it later, under public pressure. Whitman looked at Caldwell. Caldwell looked at Whitman. Then, reluctantly, Whitman sighed. Fine. James turned to Caldwell, waiting. The principal adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Eric, we shouldn't have rushed to judgment. I apologize. Eric sat frozen. He didn't know if he was in shock or if he was just waiting for someone to tell him he was dreaming. Then, slowly, Whitman exhaled. His hands clenched like it was physically painful for him to do what he was about to do. Eric, he said through gritted teeth, I'm sorry. Eric didn't say anything. Not because he couldn't, but because for the first time, he didn't have to. James clapped his hands together. Good. Now that we've settled that. He stood, towering over the desk. I'll be keeping an eye on this school. If anything like this happens again, I won't be coming alone. Caldwell's brows pulled together. Is that a threat? James grinned. No. He reached for the door handle. It's a promise. The main office door swung open, and James Williams stepped out first. Eric followed, feeling every pair of eyes in the hallway locked onto him. Students whispered. Some grinned, like they had just watched the greatest showdown in history. A few kids gave him a nod of respect, not the kind you get for being cool, but the kind that says, I saw what you did. That took guts. James didn't slow his stride. As they passed the front desk, Mrs. Dunbar sat frozen, watching the two of them walk past like she was seeing something legendary unfold in real time. They reached the 7th grade hallway, where Eric's classroom door stood open. Inside, the lesson had resumed, but the energy had shifted. Eric knew the moment he stepped back in, nothing would be the same. James stopped just outside the door and turned to his grandson. Go on, boy. Take your seat. Eric swallowed and nodded. And just like that, it was over. James turned, heading down the hallway. He didn't need a big speech. He had already said everything that mattered. The moment Eric stepped inside, the room fell silent. Mr. Whitman stood at the front, gripping his textbook a little tighter than usual. He didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge Eric's return, but Eric didn't need him to. because everyone in that room knew what had just happened. Eric slid into his seat, feeling a weight lift off his chest. The classroom carried on. The lesson continued, but something had shifted. Eric wasn't just another student anymore. He was proof. Proof that sometimes standing your ground means shaking the whole damn system. Later that afternoon, the helicopter lifted off once again. Eric stood outside with his grandfather, watching as the blades cut through the sky. The school parking lot was still half full, but by tomorrow, he knew. The whole town would be talking. James adjusted his sleeves, glancing at his grandson. "So," he said, "what did you learn today?" Eric thought about it, about how he had been ready to fight with words, how he had thought the only way to be heard was to argue louder. But his grandfather had shown him something different. Power wasn't just about being right. It was about knowing when to make people listen. Eric smirked. That when people underestimate you, it's their mistake, not yours. James chuckled. "Smart boy." They stood in silence for a moment, the sun dipping lower in the sky. Then James clapped him on the shoulder. "Next time, though, just tell me before you get yourself kicked out of school." Eric laughed. No promises. And as the helicopter disappeared into the clouds, Eric realized something. This wasn't just about him. It was about every kid who had ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. Every kid who knew something the world didn't want to hear. And today, for all of them, he made sure they did. Because knowledge isn't just power, it's a weapon. And the smartest people, they know exactly when to use it. Have you ever spoken up for the truth, only to be dismissed or silenced? How did you handle it? Would you do anything differently if you could go back? Drop your story in the comments below. And if this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that challenge the system. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.